Thank you very much. Lovely to be with you again. I do occasionally get correspondence after I speak to the League, as you can imagine, challenging me for daring to speak in such seditious circumstances. And each time I'm written to in that vein by various people, some of whom should know better, I write back saying that as a Christian bishop, indeed no less these days than an archbishop, I have an obligation to go into the highways and the byways and to seek out sinners where they are to be found and convert them. So here I am again. Now, I've given you the little cartoon, perhaps the most famous cartoon in Australia's history, from the Bulletin in the 1930s. I think nothing encapsulates Australia better than that cartoon, and that's why it's still famous. It dates back to the days when we were beginning to build what we used to call skyscrapers, and this is Sydney. And people used to stand on a ball on the end of the rope that the crane operated and guide the girders into place and then bolt them into place just standing on the girders 15 stories up. It was quite brave work, and I remember watching it as a boy with fascination. Anyway, something went slightly wrong on this occasion, and two of them slipped off. And one of them is grabbing the girder, the other one is grabbing the girder gatherer's trousers. As you can see, if you look closely, the braces have given way and one side has popped off, and the lower gentleman is supported by the trousers, which are supported by only one branch of the braces over one shoulder, and the lower gentleman is in uproarious laughter, and the upper gentleman addresses him rather meanfully, saying, "For God's sake, stop laughing, this is serious." And nothing perhaps encapsulates Australia's history more than the fact that we're always on the verge of disaster and we always laugh at it. So I begin this little overview with four vignettes, you might say, four events that are of very great significance and deserve our attention, but of course in the type of news that we now suffer with its 24-hour time scan and everything disappears by the end of the week. And none of these events have in fact attracted the thoughtful analysis that has reached each of our families around the world that are deserved. And each of them changes the way we think of ourselves as human beings, or cause us to reflect on the paucity of our current understanding of ourselves, which of course allows others with stronger minds and philosophies to gradually supplant what should be our own. And the first little vignette, and I make no apologies to those of you who are my parishioners and have heard some of this before, because they probably were asleep. But the first little vignette happened a couple of months ago. And that was when the first of the two Voyager spacecraft that were launched in the early 70s, the first one passed beyond the gravitational pull of our sun and became the first human object to genuinely enter interstellar space, the gap between the influence of the stars. And this little spacecraft that carries on its side a gold-plated plaque with an etching of a man and a woman, and affixed to the plaque is one of the world's first DVDs, about 20 years before they became commercially available, with digital instructions on how to build a machine to play it, and which contains images of both humans and animals, and of a beach, and of New York. for the edification of those who will be able to build a machine and play it in some other world at some other time. And this little spacecraft, which carries enough fuel to get it to the next world, deliberately, and has already been travelling for just over 40 years, 16 years ago passed the orbit of Pluto and went into that deeply unknown to us as yet area of semi-planets and rocks that strew the outer part of our solar system, where comets dwell and occasionally come towards us. This little spacecraft was steered into a pathway towards our nearest sun neighbour, Sirius, which is only 4 light years away, and therefore had to go above the trajectory of our solar system and its planets, and so could look down on us, and sent back one final photograph as a bid us farewell, which shows all the planets and our own sun as a tiny pinprick of light, like any other star, in the vast distance. Well, in just 263 years' time, it will fly into the next star's solar system, so remote from us that we haven't a clue if it's even got planets, and will send back photographs of that solar system, the next nearest to us. And as Alfred Deakin so famously said about our Constitution, the Constitution we seek to prepare is for the generations unseen, unknown, and as yet unborn. So did those who designed this spacecraft 50 years ago and took 10 years to build it and then successfully launched it. In just a little over 260 years' time, the humans who succeed us will receive the first photos of our nearest neighbour. And our consciousness of ourselves is changing forever as a result of what we have done as human beings. As the consciousness of Europeans 400 and 500 years ago changed when they set out on sailing ships to see if there was anything here. And it took several hundred years to discover that there was. And then after we arrived, it took a rowing boat to row round this country to prove it was an island, and put the bits of the map that the Europeans have made from east and west and south and north together, and actually draw a map of what we were standing in. And that took 40 years after we arrived officially. So are we now piecing together a much bigger map, which will alter our consciousness of ourselves. That little object with its gold-plated side is not to be underestimated in the course of human history. And none of us will be here to see the pictures it sends back. The second little image, if I may, is the opposite end of the spectrum, perhaps even more significant. For that little spacecraft is the first object to actually escape our sun from within its own worlds. It now is not in the least bit influenced by the gravitational field of the sun. It can never be drawn back. It has escaped. In that world's largest scientific instrument that, for reasons that have nothing to do with science, is half under Switzerland and half under France on the French-Swiss border near Geneva, the Hadron Collider, which is by any standards a most amazing instrument, earlier this year believes it detected what has been known for 40 years or so as the God particle. That which existed at the very beginning, which gave everything else its form and nature. The fact is, none of us know, because nobody knows, what gravity is or what causes it. All we know is that when we jump, we come down again quite quickly. We don't know why. One of the reasons that space exploration is so difficult is we have not found out what it is that stops the rocket going up. So we haven't been able to overcome it except by brute force. There is something within the makeup of every atom that gives the nucleus the power to hold the spinning electrons together and keep them spinning, just as the sun keeps the planets spinning. We don't know what it is. But if it wasn't there, our bodies would simply spin apart into microscopic little elements and be lost. That which gives everything its form and nature. And on that vast screen that looks like a camera but is about 100 metres high, which makes it quite a big camera under the border of Switzerland and France, in that extraordinary circular tunnel in which parts of atoms are accelerated near the speed of light in an attempt to imitate what happened in the beginning. The particles have been detected that are thought to give the nucleus of the atom its mass, and therefore are the source of gravity, the force that holds the entire cosmos together, the force that holds the stars in our Milky Way, more than 1 billion of them, into their shape and relate to one another. And there's 1 billion other galaxies like the Milky Way, and they all relate to each other too, with this same fundamental force. And humans have been thinking about that since science began, and now look as if they might be on the way. The first tentative, childish steps to understand the nature of all things. Once again, humans begin to look on themselves in a new and different way, as yet childish, but perhaps beginning to be mature. Perhaps the human race with these two events is moving into adolescence of self-understanding. Now, the other two little events are more trivial in a way, but show what's happening. One is, of course, the riots and the deaths earlier this week in South Africa. Now, in a country that has over 30,000 murders a year, a few more shouldn't surprise us. And I speak as one who loves it and goes there regularly, but doesn't in any way underestimate its problems and difficulties. And I'm not going to dwell on the politics, even though I'm tempted, because I was absolutely fascinated at how it all happened. What is more important is it's a platinum mine. And platinum, as those of you who are chemists will understand, is an element that in the formation of planets is drawn by the iron core of the planets like Earth into the core. There is no platinum on Earth that occurred naturally in the beginning. It's all in the middle. The only platinum on Earth has landed from outer space, either from asteroids or other heavenly bodies being caught up in our gravity as we spiraled through the Milky Way for the past numerous billion years. All platinum, which is essential to modern life, is from outer space, and that's fascinating in itself. It's large lumps of it that have crashed into our surface at various times. And of course our cars depend on it, our televisions depend on it, there's some of it in each of your mobile phones, and so on. We can't do without it, and yet it's landed accidentally in times past on our surface. It's simply worth noting that little fact. I will go on to draw in a moment the lesson, how little we know of the origins of everything that surrounds us, how much we have grown apart from the everyday circumstances. Now, I made an absolute point this morning, knowing that I was going to give this talk and that Betty Lukes is a ruthless taskmaster, and that I shouldn't leave myself open to any obvious questions. So I am actually able to tell you that of all the things I'm wearing, and I haven't a clue where most of the ingredients came from, I have nonetheless made absolutely sure that my undies came from Indian-grown cotton, which was made in India and which I bought last December in Switzerland and brought back to Australia on an A380. So I am conscious of the origin of my undies, but of everything else that surrounds me, I haven't a clue. And I suggest that almost all of us in this room haven't the same clue about everything in our homes as well as on our bodies. Yeah. And so I mention the platinum just because it's one of the most fascinating examples of something until a century ago utterly useless, which had arrived by accident, the accident of our own sun's pathway through the Milky Way, which is in itself fascinating, and is one of the only remnants left of that pathway, whereas Mars and the Moon, which have been less volcanically active, of course, still bear many traces of where they've been. And one of the things, of course, that the Curiosity vehicle is trying to discover over the next 2 years is not whether life began on Mars. That's interesting, and it is going to try and discover that yet again. But whether there was life on Mars that was gathered from places we have been in our journey through our galaxy over the last several billion years, in which traces might have been left. Because our sun, of course, began quite near the middle and has been spiralling out ever since in our spiral galaxy, moving out through one of the arms. And along the way we passed through one of the other arms many eons ago. Our consciousness of ourselves. And finally, and even more trivially, I was interested to note that in the next few weeks the 500th human being will pay Virgin Galactic $200,000 US cash up front to secure their ticket to go in the new Virgin spacecraft, which is undergoing its final trials as we speak, and which will take them 6 at a time, these 500 people, 120 miles above the Earth, way above the atmosphere, from which they will experience for their $200,000 US about 6 minutes of weightlessness, and will float around the little spacecraft because they'll be almost outside the force of Earth's gravity. They will be able to see the Earth as a single globe from that distance and see the atmosphere as a tiny golden band around the blue planet. In other words, we will be able to see our home in increasing numbers for just $200,000 US a pop. But the fact is 500 people have already paid. There is a thirst to understand and to see and to experience what that glorious photo showed us in the days of people actually walking on the moon, of the surface of the moon with the sun in the distance and the blue earth rising beyond it. Earthrise instead of moonrise. And we understood for the first time, visibly as an image, how we do float on a fragile planet in a vast, so vast we cannot comprehend, cosmos that is somehow all put together from the fractionally minute particles that we are now discovering in a long circular tube under Switzerland and France. Now I begin with all that because myths are constantly challenged by reality. And we are in a stage where reality is growing so swiftly we can genuinely say incrementally. It no longer takes centuries to find something. We now expand our knowledge and double it and then double it again and double it again. Within the time that we were at school, and I speak of people of roughly the same age, within the time that we were at school, almost no new knowledge was invented. A few discoveries were made. Within the time our grandchildren are at school at the present time, the body of scientific knowledge will increase 3 or 4 times over. Things that were totally unknown in grade 1 will be routine by year 12. And our grandchildren are coping with a world in which the horizon constantly expands in terms of human knowledge of ourselves and the cosmos. But dare I say, in which the ruthless extinction of the explanations is greater than it has been at any time in the last 2,000 years. The knowledge is expanding. The understanding is contracting just as quickly and being consciously destroyed. And so our ability to process knowledge, unsurprisingly, is becoming more and more remote from us. And we are, as it were, unguided. And if that little Voyager spacecraft, number 1, number 2 is on a different pathway and I won't even go there, it's going to take almost 3,000 years to reach its next destination, and that gives a new dimension to patience. And will the record still be there so that somebody tunes in to get the photos when it sends them back in the year 5,000 and something? That does make us pause when you look at the records we've got from ancient Mesopotamia, 2000 BC. That's only 4,000 years ago. NASA has to actually tune in a radio in 5,000 years to get Voyager 2 on the line, and it intends to. And that's another nearby star, not a remote one. We're not even out of the Milky Way yet, a home galaxy of 1 billion others. Just get ourselves in perspective here, because we have come to believe that God is very like us. And it's only when we begin to contemplate the cosmos that we begin to see the mind of God. I actually made a bride cry. It's a fatal flaw if you're doing a wedding to make a bride cry. But I was giving my little spiff at one of my niece's weddings up at Epiphany Crafers recently, and I gave this sort of condensed image of 260 years away to the nearest star, and there's 1 billion stars, and then I said, you know, God is so loving that God who made all that is now giving his full attention to this little stone building on an insignificant part of his planetary system and listening to your vows. I'll never do it again. But it's a beautiful thought and should give us all pause, because that is the myth being joined to the reality, without which reality has no meaning. And so we have a national myth that is under massive challenge from a number of sources, and I'd like to just outline momentarily, as our Americans say, some of the sources. Firstly, the notion of a nation is changing very rapidly. And so our ideas about national integrity, sovereignty, and therefore the source of law and of our laws as a nation, our sense of belonging, our understanding of who we are, let alone why we are, is all under extraordinary threat, as it is for the people of every other nation. It used to be said, and this was encapsulated in the famous treaties of Vienna that created our current sense of international relations almost 200 years ago, that to be a nation you needed at least three attributes. You had to have a clear set of geography that was agreed upon by you and others, boundaries that were not in dispute, that other nations respected, and that your own people respected. Secondly, you needed to have a population that belonged to that geography. They agreed they belonged, and everybody else agreed they belonged. When you breathlessly reached Heathrow with your Australian passport, people respected it. That is a person who belongs to that piece of geography, girded by its own international boundaries, called Australia. And you are Australian. So a people that were agreed to belong. There might be others in Australia at any given moment who are not Australian, here on other nations' passports, and we all know they're not Australian. Then we've got a group that we fight over. Do they belong or do they not? And how do you come to belong? These are the legitimate questions of international law. And thirdly, you needed the means to police 1 and 2. You had to be able to defend your borders, your geography, and you had to be able to enforce justice and order among the population. In other words, a government in charge of A and B. And if you had all three in place, you could be acknowledged to be a nation. Almost immediately, these things came under challenge, but as we have seen, things go faster now than they used to. We had a number of wars, including 2 global wars, that challenged the concept of boundaries and peoples, but largely emerged unscathed. Although some of the boundaries that were created after both World War I and World War II were not internationally respected and have failed to survive. And some of the governments that were allegedly in charge failed to gain legitimacy and eventually failed to survive. The most significant of those events, of course, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and symbolised by the fall of the wall within Berlin. We shouldn't forget that there was a whole wall from the top to the bottom of Europe that also collapsed at the time of the Berlin Wall, along with the governments of all the countries along the wall. Their sovereignty did not exist, therefore did not survive a viable challenge. There are now many things that make it impossible for any national government to observe the three rules. Firstly, there is a massive movement of peoples globally, and nations are finding it extremely difficult to exert adequate control over their people once they leave the geography. At any given moment, it's only about 25 million Australians, at any given moment there are roughly 1 million Australians in England and Europe whose governments exercise jurisdiction, and this government largely doesn't. Some countries have a majority of their people outside their geography at any given moment. Much more significantly, advances in global defence technology and global communications means no government any longer has control over what passes its borders. Rockets, satellites, surveillance, Google Earth satellites. I don't know if any of you have seen the pictures when you were ordering your solar cells for the roof from the Google satellites that most of the suppliers use. You could certainly see the washing on my line from space and identify the objects. My government cannot stop Google from taking pictures of me in my backyard, and nor can they stop Google listening to my telephone anytime. My government can no longer guarantee my privacy or security, and doesn't any longer pretend to. Sovereignty has been diminished. Power has changed from a national government to international organisations that are not accountable to any government. And so the nature of sovereignty, nationality and power has diminished, and diminished in some areas massively. No government can stop the internet. China's tried mightily and hasn't. You can tinker with it, but you can't stop it. No longer can a government even think of passing laws about censorship because they are meaningless. And so in area after area, the nature of the nation has been diminished. When we get on to economics, the ability of a nation to control the value of its currency, the value of its production, even the nature of its production, has been almost entirely removed. And yet Vienna clearly identified in its international treaties the idea of a nation being sovereign over its wealth and particularly its currency. And its sovereignty over its currency was a guarantee of its wealth and its ability to govern its people. And so the nature of what Alfred Deakin thought he was doing when he sat down in the dining room at St Mark's College, as it now is, in the Downer House to be exact, Alex's grandfather's city house, when he sat there with the other drafters of the Constitution in the early 1890s and went about the Constitution we seek to prepare, the concept that he thought he was creating of a nation is no longer the reality. And when we appeal to the constitutional documents and the other founding documents of Australia, such as the early legislation of that first decade, the national institutions that were created, the High Court, arbitration, immigration, industrial relations, the relationship between the states, the armed forces, and so on. The founding assumptions on which those were made are no longer the reality with which Australian governments must deal. Therefore, we should be in a period of radically rethinking how we can embed those founding philosophies and re-energise the institutions that seek to give our aspirations for orderly living together as a unique nation and orderly and systematically exploiting our resources and achieving the aims for which we believe we exist. That work should be happening quietly, thoughtfully and systematically, but is not. Secondly, the changing idea of the person. We have embedded our reality as a nation on the Christian idea of person. The Christian idea of person is that a person exists uniquely before God as a unique, never to be repeated individual whose individualism will endure beyond this earthly life. That we exist for a reason, and the reason being to live out our lives according to the laws that God has implanted in creation, what some call the natural law. Laws that do not depend on any enactment of any human government, but have been enacted in all eternity from the very nature of things. Just as when we jump up, we will return to the point we jump from, is a law of nature that none of us have managed to overcome. And if we were able to destroy that law, the entire cosmos would cease to exist, and chaos in the matter from which everything is made and which exists in an orderly relationship, each portion to another, would cease to exist. So, in our dealings one with another, there are immutable truths we have believed, such as the difference between truth and falsehood, the difference between life and death, the difference between ownership and not owning something, the difference between fidelity in relationship and infidelity. A series of things encapsulated in what we call the Ten Commandments, a series of immutable principles about the very nature of being human. We are currently moving into a period in the world where the two most populous nations do not derive their understanding of human reality from Christianity. It is the first time in 2,000 years that we have moved into such a period. It should therefore be noteworthy. In fact, the separation from our Christian origins, which are themselves derived from 2,000 years of Jewish history before Christ, and therefore encompass almost the whole of recorded human history. In other words, we have never consciously existed in a period in which these principles have been challenged and the challenger has won. And in fact, even in prehistory, which still endures, I frequently visit the Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea. The people, fascinatingly, had a history of paganism. They had only one god, and in each of the three islander languages, the word for that god is the word malus. They worshipped Malus until 1882. They used to sacrifice to Malus, a young lady, in a fire. It's a pretty fierce god. Fascinatingly, they didn't know it. I could hardly believe it the first time I heard it. Malus, of course, is the Latin word for evil. And they got there all on their own without any contact with missionaries or Westerners or white people. They simply plucked a word, and it was the same word in 3 languages which otherwise are almost totally different, like the Papua New Guinea languages. So I was once told a story by an elderly lady on Saibai Island, which is the most culturally sophisticated right up near the coast. If you were game, you could walk to Papua New Guinea, to the village on the other side of the Australian border at low tide. It's only about 700 or 800 metres to the beach on the other side. It's got crocodiles, poisonous snakes, and various other beasts in the water, which is why I've never walked. But there is a lovely strip of white sand at low tide, which actually is the boundary between Australia and Papua New Guinea. And I was explained that when the missionaries came, the people became Christian and left aside all that. But they already had a powerful concept of almost everything in the 10 Commandments. Truth and falsehood. Very powerful sense of fidelity in marriage, in relationships. Care for children. Powerful sense of property, which of course Eddie Mabo exploited in the famous Mabo case. They actually had boundaries showing who owned what. But then the people, somewhat without their knowledge, the mission was handed on from the London Missionary Society to the Church of England. This is a colony, of course, in those days. And so an Anglican bishop was duly consecrated for the Torres Strait and came out on a ship and landed on Saibai, where, being an Anglican, he determined to go on as he intended to go on, and he was an Anglo-Catholic, so he was going to have High Mass on the first Sunday, and he'd bought all the gear, smoke machines, the whole bit, you know, vestments and red things for the altar boys, the whole bit came from Lambeth Palace. So within a week he actually trained a choir and the altar boys. These people are wonderful at picking up ritual and dance and so on. They still do. Absolutely wonderful. And of course, like people without a written language, they remember everything and still do. You dare not say something that you hope they'll forget, because they don't. I've suffered from that several times. And, but Father, you said 15 years ago. So he had a High Mass. And there he is standing at the altar of the offertory, incense going up, when the entire congregation of 800 people burst into tears and started wailing behind him. Well, he wondered what he'd done wrong, and afterwards he asked one of the elderly ladies, it's a matriarchal society, so he thoughtfully didn't ask the boys, "What have I done wrong? You all cried. Why did you cry? It was beautiful." "Oh no, Father, we weren't crying because we were sad. We're crying because we were moved. We used to sacrifice this young girl," the old lady said. These people are telepathic, I might add, still. They will burst into tears in Cairns when Auntie dies on an island 3 hours before the phone call comes. And so he said, when that smoke went up on the altar, we thought of when we used to burn the young girl to that bad God we had. And then we all realised, Father, that was just preparing us for the sacrifice of Jesus. This is on day one of becoming Anglican. You know, I've got people who haven't twigged to that yet, I might say. They saw the continuity between them as a people of prehistory, who had not yet begun to record their history, as the ancient Greeks began to in the Odyssey nearly 4,000 years ago. They saw the continuity. I say that as a footnote. But humankind has an affinity with the natural order of things, which contemporary people of the left in places like Australia are seeking to destroy. And so the nature of the person is a current mass area of political dispute, in which the image of Islam, Hinduism, communism, that covers the Middle East, India and China, just for starters, that's most of the world's population, which have not deeply experienced the Christian philosophy, and our society is not heavily based on what we identify as those basic principles, although they have some of them, and in some cases have had many of them, but are uncompromisingly under threat. The individual does not exist as an individual who forms relationships, but as the inconsequential part of a much greater machine for which they exist and live and die unregretted. And so two great philosophies are contesting the nature of the individual. And the globalization of economics, which increasingly is based in those parts of the world, whether it be the oil or the manufacturing, the economic driving force of countries like ours, is to force us to also implement that type of society which removes Christian individualism, autonomy and dignity, and replaces it with that which is unknown, unknowable and controllable. We are all struggling with the everyday consequences of what science and technology can do, which was once among the most sacred and intimate areas of personal life, and is now a scientific commodity to be peddled and advertised and negotiated. And I think, if anything brought home to me my minority status as a heterosexual father and grandfather since I saw you last, and I'm so thrilled. If anything brought home to me my impending, at least, minority status, it was in the lead up to the Olympics, when that married couple were refused the permission to sleep together, and at the same time two boys or two girls shacked up were allowed to sleep together in the Olympic Village. And one of the Australian swimming team, which may explain why we didn't win anything, one of the boys, who apparently has outed himself as a homosexual, was interviewed on, where else, the ABC, and in which he, with infinite condescension, said, "Why should they? They're only breeders." And as a phrase that was new to me, I don't normally walk in these exalted circles. I thought if anything had brought home to me the denigration of the family and the destructive forces against the family, and indeed natural procreation, then it was that phrase, "We're only breeders." And I thought of the cocoons in 1984 in the novel. And the breeding goes on in an anonymous white building somewhere, but is not something ordinary society touches or wishes to. And so the concept of family as the unit of society which all else exists to nurture, because it is within which our culture, our values, our philosophies are expressed. And we could talk about a national family as an extension of all our families combined. And we could go into grief as a national family, or joy. We could unite as a national family. You know, Curtin's great speeches of World War II, men and women of Australia, which Bob Hawke took up and didn't acknowledge. I told him, don't worry. Men and women of Australia, and we all were at one with him, is a concept that must be destroyed. And the destruction is achieved through destroying the nucleus, which is each individual family as a cell within your body, once corrupted and growing in an alien way, will with absolute certainty destroy your whole living fabric through cancer. So the destruction of the cells of society, which are the family, will inexorably and certainly destroy the very basis that binds the nation together, and that which was its life force is destroyed. Two simple phrases. We are engulfed with two forces which both should be resisted. The first one is the force to simplify everything. We are no longer capable of complex thought. We're no longer given the means of carrying out complex thought. The analysis of a Shakespearean play is beyond us, because it's got more than one plot and more than one act. It's got more than one emotion, more than one force, more than one character. But in the ability to analyse many threads of human behaviour interacting came our ability to deal with a complex society. And once we lose that ability, we have to simply do what we are told in order to survive. And they become too powerful. The ability to perform complex operations, it all happens somewhere else. We don't know who made our undies or where the materials came from or even what the materials are. I haven't a clue what this suit is made of. I could look at the label and I'd probably be none the wiser. I don't know where. And even if it says made in Australia, it doesn't mean the fabric was, it just means the cutting out was. Or perhaps it was cut out somewhere else and sewn up in Australia, so that trims could say made in Australia. Like my orange juice is made from imported ingredients and local ingredients. One orange satisfies in a tonne to be labelled imported and Australian ingredients. One orange in a tonne, Woolies have to add. They have this orange that was grown in Australia, which they add to tonne after tonne of stuff from somewhere else, so it can be deemed to be local. The force for simplicity and naivety is a force that is conspiring against our national interest. And so is the power of unification, the power to unify all the systems in the world. Where does the internet run from? Nowhere in Australia that we know of. Where do I ring up to complain about my credit card as I did last week? Well, the accent was tricky. And I was eventually given a fax number that was meant to be Melbourne, but I suspected was going through to another country. Where does your ANZ money machine connect to? Where is the computer? I can tell you that one, it's in Singapore, where your accounts are kept. The force to unify and to distort and destroy what is local is an instrument of international government. And so I conclude by warning you that there are an infinity of powerful forces seeking to destroy that which we take for granted. They are forces mainly beyond our shores, but with allies within. I conclude with the image, for God's sake stop laughing, this is serious, the image of what needs to be done, and we all know about this in inner Adelaide, when your house shows signs of salt damp. You can buy 4 litres of stuff from Bunnings which you paint onto it, and it will not reappear for at least 2 months. And meanwhile the building will continue to collapse. But you will be unconscious of it because you can't see it. You can, on the other hand, get in somebody who will replace those bits of stone. But of course, the bits of Adelaide Hills rock that form the foundations, because we didn't have concrete, did we? I'm always intrigued, you know, they built the Roman Colosseum from concrete, but early Adelaide didn't. And we do have to keep reinventing things. Civilization is not a straight line upwards, it's a series of undulations. The ancient Greeks had flushing toilets, and then it disappeared for 600 or 700 years. Eventually the Americans, somebody called Crapper, invented flushing toilets and claims that that was the original flushing toilet. The Greek excavations for the Olympics in Athens excavated public toilets that flushed from 500 BC.
I was aware when I was a boy at school that trade was a swap between 2 countries, that one has the other and they make that swap. Now what's happening now, in my belief, is that trade is an evil thing that is actually being used to make people throughout every country in the world to be dependent on another country, and that's a binding circumstance. What would you say about that, Archbishop?
Trade is a wonderful thing, and humans have traded since day one, so we're not against it. It is a natural thing. The great trading patterns of Australian Aboriginal people, I've in my time at the Northern Territory University spent a good deal of time in Arnhem Land, and there are good evidence of some clays coming from northern and even southern Australia in use in Arnhem Land, as well as pieces of stone, flint particularly, that came from northern South Australia. So the patterns of actually, these are very powerful patterns for people who had to walk. And they used to, my students who were Aboriginal used to talk about, we used to go walkabout, they'd say, John, but now we go Toyota walkabout. But it still happens. So trade is enormously powerful. The tin mines of Wales fed the tin factories of Rome in the 1st century AD, and so on. You know, it's just very natural. So that is, put that there and smoke it, you might say. On the other hand, trade is always has a tendency to be unequal. And this goes back to original sin. Not only do human beings have a tendency to do evil as the easier pathway and have to be taught to do good, and not one of the founding philosophies of much current state education in Australia, and that should worry us. But so do nations have to be taught to be good, because they do have a normal inclination to do wrong. If you can help yourself, take it. If you're more powerful, take advantage of it. And that's why things like the Treaty of Vienna were a civilising moment, and why we should regret the demise of those treaties in international law and trade and the movement of people. But yes, trade is now massively unequal because we no longer are a people who mostly produce locally what we need for life. And because most of what we need we don't have, and that applies to almost every nation. If Australia could only use the fuels that it has, we'd have steam trains. We'd also have steam cars, and we used to make them around 1910, and they were very good. The Stanley steamer, for instance, could go from Melbourne to Sydney on the dirt road that there was at the time, pre-World War I, without any great difficulty. The great Arthur Calwell, I'm not going to start a saga, but the great Arthur Calwell, Minister for Immigration, he of two wongs don't make a white. There are some things you wish you'd thought of first. But he refused to fly during World War II to cabinet meetings in Canberra. He was based in Melbourne. He drove at night because he worked all day. And his driver and he would go up the Hume Highway. It wasn't a very good road in those days, and he had arranged with many local farms all the way along to put out heaps of manure, horse and cow. And he had a gas machine on the trailer on the back. The car ran on methane. And he didn't use petrol because it was rationed for the war. Instead of that, the Minister for Immigration shovelled manure through the night. And if you've seen photos of World War II Adelaide, I've seen one of North Terrace, where half the cars had a trailer with a canvas tent on the back, full of manure, driving the engine. All sorts of things we would have done, but it wouldn't have been petrol, which we get from a long way away in the main. And increasingly in a world with the highest population we've ever had, certain difficulties of food production, diminishing range of food and so on, diminishing species and types. I've just got seeds for this year of triamble. Whoever last grew triamble in their backyard, been saved by a firm in Australia, this heritage Australian pumpkin, which I remember as a boy, haven't seen since. I'll let you know next year. Trade is now essential, therefore open to massive exploitation. Secondly, the growth of the number of nations in the world, now over 200, and most of the poorest 100 are not as rich as most of the top 100 companies in the world. Therefore, we have a slippage from sovereignty to individual wealth. And increasingly it's the individual corporations that control the trade between nations because they are more powerful both financially and in terms of indispensability than are most nations in the world. And Australia is in there in the top 100 nations, but heavily dependent on a number of things it does not and cannot produce, and utterly dependent on the economies of nations whose ethics are not the same as ours, to provide us with the income so that we can buy the things we actually need, like undies.